and welcome. I am so excited that you all are joining us today. My name is Sydney Ross. I'm the outdoor educational manager with Deep Roots, and we have an incredible story for you today. And I first want to just go over a couple things. First and foremost, thanking our sponsors, Johnson County Park and Recreation District, for bringing us this part of the series today. This is our first episode of exploring Johnson County Park's property during our lunch and learn. And so we have some very exciting episodes coming. But for today, we have our Woodland Spring Ephemeral episode, which we'll jump into shortly. In addition to our sponsor, Johnson County Parks and Recreation District, I want to thank supporters and viewers like you for your support of our educational programs. If you like what you see today, consider joining me for a guided naturalist walk on Saturday, April 13th. Our rainout date is scheduled for May 4th, but I hope you will join us because it's one thing to view nature from a screen or in a book, and it's another to jump in and see it firsthand. So we have 11 tickets left. There are 2 sessions, one at 8 a.m. and another at 11. So I will include resources following today's program via email, as well as links for these programs in the chat once we get started. And if you're looking for inspiration for your native garden this year, consider joining our Deep Roots Habitat Garden Tour presented by the Gattermeyer Family Foundation. Every second Saturday, starting this month, we will be visiting several native gardens in various stages of progress. So it's a great way to look and see what other folks are doing in our community and get inspiration for your own garden. And if you're thinking, well, Sid, I'm inspired, but I may not exactly know how to garden with natives, consider joining me for one of my work and learn gardening days at the Discovery Center. We have 5 a month, and there's always a lot of fun. They have cover various topics like spring weed ID. We're addressing cool season annuals currently, as well as just understanding native plants throughout the season. So there's lots of practical tips and insight, as well as a lot of fun and camaraderie with other native plants people. Join us for our next webinar on April 18th, Native Plants at Noon on the Road to Maple Woods Natural Area. We will be visiting an old growth forest and spring ephemerals there in the Gladstone area. This is our virtual event. And I got to meet with Chuck Honor just the other day to film this episode, and it's pretty exciting. So I hope you'll join us in a couple weeks for Native Plants at Noon on the Road to Maple Woods Natural Area. All right, and I am absolutely thrilled to introduce today's guest speakers. Matt Garrett, Natural Resource Manager, and Drew Dobelier, okay, I'm gonna get this wrong, Dobelier. They will be joining us later once we complete this video clip and we have the Q&A going, but they will be here to offer some really good insight about what we've been doing. So you can see them on the screen. Waved to us, guys. Awesome. They have brought so much insight, and we really had a wonderful hike together through Cedar Niles, and I learned a ton, not just about the spring ephemerals, but how they manage these areas. So Matt Garrett, I'll just go ahead and do a couple quick intros. He is the Natural Resource Manager for the Gold Medal Award-winning Johnson County Park and Recreation District. He's dedicated his entire career to environmental education and natural resource management in the Kansas City region. Matt is a regional conservation leader focused on large-scale prairie restoration, invasive plant removal, and conservation planning. In his spare time, he mountain bikes and throws frisbees to his blue heeler. And Drew, our other guest speaker, he is the natural resource technician for JCPRD. He specializes in arboriculture and all forms of habitat management, both terrestrial and aquatic, for 8,700 acres of natural areas in Johnson County. In his spare time, he hunts morels, plays disc golf, and fishes across the Midwest. I've also seen a very impressive antler Christmas tree that he formed using tons of antler sheds, right? I believe that's what those are called, to form a beautiful Christmas tree. So Drew, I definitely will have a question about that when we get into the Q&A, but I just appreciate both of your passions for our natural areas here in the Kansas City region. and I'm very pleased to present today's episode of Lunch and Learn at Cedar Niles Park. Let's get started.
So Cedar Niles is a really busy park, thousands of visitors, lots of hikers, lots of mountain bikers, and so hikers and pedestrians have the right of way, and mountain bikers, cyclists yield. So when you're out enjoying the wildflowers, you may come across cyclists, they'll say hi, and the hiker does have the right of way.
Good to know.
Looks like a little Dutchman's Breach coming right out of the rock there.
Look at that.
Hopefully Drew can find some cool trees up here.
Yes. Oh, and this one right here.
I've been staring.
That's cute.
It's silly, but one of my favorite things about Cedar Niles is the amount of moss and lichens growing on the trees and rocks out here. Everywhere you go through this park, there's just gorgeous old oaks covered in moss and lichens, and it's really neat patterns in nature when you see all the cool green colors on these north-facing slopes.
It's really luscious, and you know what the rule is, right? When you encounter moss,
You must touch.
you must touch. You must touch.
No.
Oh, look at the little sedge blooming.
Oh yeah.
Cutie.
We were seeing those the other day. There's some right here on the edge.
Oh, so adorable. Oh yeah, right in front of me.
Little woodland sedges popping.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is that eastern wood sedge, you think?
I'm gonna leave that to you, the native plant.
I'm gonna say yes. We just did an episode on this.
That's a common.
Or it could be, I mean, I don't know if Pennsylvania sedge is up here, but stay tuned for the magical text that'll appear on the screen to ID. But just look at that. It looks like luscious hair. It's so cute. And you can see, you know, no one's out here giving this a haircut, right? But if this were in your own garden, you might consider doing that. But it's a little too late because it's already blooming. Another cutie.
Look how straight that hedge tree is.
That's wild.
Let me see.
Right there, that one.
Oh, wow.
It's a really straight one that grew in the woods.
Is that a Osage orange?
Yes.
Nice. So you see that. Usually they're low and kind of gnarly and thick when they're planted intentionally, right?
Yeah, and Osage orange, called hedge or called bodark, were prized by Native Americans for bows because the wood is so strong, and they would actually. This tree didn't used to kind of be in the area. I think it was more like in Oklahoma. It's been a while since college, so I'm trying to remember some of that. But they would build bows out of this, so it was highly prized then. And nowadays, a lot of people prize it for like fence posts and other kinds of things. But you usually don't see it coming into the deep woods. You usually see it more on the edges. I think I remember it's somewhat shade intolerant, so it doesn't like being shaded out.
Interesting.
But to see one, yeah, so tall and straight is kind of an odd.
Right? Well, maybe it had to grow that way so it could live in this woodland situation, right? So it could get enough sunlight. Yeah. Something I do know about Osage orange is the big fruits, the hedge apples, used to be eaten by prehistoric sloths and other animals. So you'll notice. Yes, megafauna, some little big friends. And you may notice nowadays we have squirrels who enjoy them, but notice that they will only eat the seeds. So they shred the whole exterior because it's pretty sappy and nasty, and then they'll enjoy the seeds. But yeah, so giant megafauna, redundant, but they would take the hedge apples and spread them around.
Also on that with the megafauna, like locust trees were kind of the same way. The reason locusts have such big thorns on them were to protect themselves from megafauna trying to get to the seed pods. And now that all the megafauna is gone, trees have genetically not really changed, because in their lifetime, to them, they live hundreds of years. They don't realize that nothing's left to do that anymore, so they're still the way they were. As you know, hundreds and thousands of years ago, they still think that things are still here that's going to threaten them.
Times in these bottomland areas, when we build a park, you'll see remnants. You'll see old limestone rubble wall fences, you'll see old tanks, you'll see foundations, you'll find old pieces of fiberglass emerging, old landfills that farmers may have made. And specifically at this park, we found wells. So we actually found a natural gas well that had to be capped.
Oh my gosh.
Other parks, we found oil wells that have been unmanaged. And so a lot of times when you take over 1,000 acres of land, it's not just building a park, it's finding hazards, it's finding open wells, it's finding cisterns, and it's a lot of traversing a landscaping, making sure a piece of land that's been quite rural is safe for the public to experience. And so you look down in a hole and you're like, oh, that's a 25-foot hand dug well, and we have to cap it. It's a neat experience to know a piece of land before it's public, and when it's just been a wild landscape for, decades, and then being able to be here and help kind of massage the paved trails in, so we protect the big old wolf oaks and make sure that the single track goes in and doesn't take out too many wildflowers, and kind of knowing the landscape and then kind of building the park into it is really important, and making sure you just don't bulldoze a really neat place.
Well, I can tell there's a lot of care and love that goes into everything you all do, and I appreciate that.
So back before it was a park, I would come and look at this, and then as the park was developing, so I would come in down the bottomland and I would follow this drainage ravine all the way up to the top, to the plateau, because coming up these steep sides, as you can see, are somewhat hard to go up.
Loose rock, not
hard to climb. So if you took this drainage, you could shoot straight up the drainage right up to the plateau on top and get there much easier without injuring yourself.
That's smart.
And this was probably a glade at one point. When we look at a rock slope like this, before fire was removed from the landscape, something rocky like this would have probably been a little more open.
I was gonna say, so these are pretty young trees. They look fairly small.
And 80% of this county was tall grass prairie in the 1850s.
Yeah.
And so really we would have only had big timber in our riparian areas and our, deep north-facing slopes. And so most of this county would have been just rolling prairie and glades and just limited forest. And that's obviously changed in the last, 170 years.
Yeah, and some of the trees we're seeing here, like this one, or eastern hophorn beam, very, very slow-growing native tree. This tree could already be 15 or 20 years old.
Really?
Its life. Its other name is ironwood because of how hard the wood is. At this time of year, you can kind of ID it better, because a lot of, like up in there, you'll see there's brown leaves still hanging onto branches. And that's a good way to identify it. In the summertime, kind of resembles an American elm, but it had medicinal uses by Native Americans when they were still around to use it for stuff like that. But yeah, it's an understory tree. They don't usually get very tall. Rare occurrences, they can get up to 50 feet. But around here, if you see one that's probably 25 feet, you're seeing something.
That's really cool, because I would have just assumed, looking at just the diameter of the trunk, that it was a fairly young tree. And again, trees are a gap in my knowledge right now. But to me, this looks like a young tree. So what you're saying is, because they grow slow, and they're in this kind of rockier hillside, that would also probably make them slow growing too, I would think, right?
Yes, yeah. And if you get down into like a river bottom, they would have the potential to potentially grow better and faster. But like, we have a wide variety in Kansas, from trees like this that are very slow growing to the state tree, the cottonwood, which is the fastest growing tree in North America, that it could be 50 years old and be huge already.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't realize that. That's awesome. I love having a tree expert with us.
So use that word loosely.
A tree enthusiast.
There we go.
Certified arborist.
Yeah, you are. So I wanted to ask y'all, so you are a certified arborist?
Yes, so I'm a state of Kansas certified arborist. I went to school for it in Manhattan. You have to take a course and then pass a test. So I've actually been through that. So now every year I attend training in the state to keep up my certification.
He's taken wildland fire classes for dropping trees. So Drew is an expert at trees, hazard trees. So when we have a tree that's fully engulfed on a fire, he usually gets to jump out and
Crazy.
Drop a burning tree. So.
That's pretty metal.
Yeah.
Pretty sure I can find a video of me dropping a tree on fire.
So when you think about natural resource work, you take most of the top 10 most dangerous jobs in North America and you put them together. Fisheries, you have forestry, you have agriculture, you have firefighting, and wildlife work. And so you put all these things together into one job, and you take most of the most dangerous professions there are and create one kind of job out of it. We're super safe. We make sure that anything we do, we're just being incredibly cautious, whether it's prescribed.
Of course.
Or where it's, tree work that it's dangerous work, so we're always making sure everybody gets home safely at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely. But I take it in your spare time.
I'm out exploring in the woods all over the place, seeing new things, and I'm just curious.
And our staff do
Love
recreate
it.
in the parks. I'm out mountain biking, Drew's disc golfing and fishing, and you'll find our staff out using our parks outside of work. So it's not something where we just go home.
Yeah.
At 5 o'clock, we're all out, experiencing nature and recreating outside of our work hours.
It's part of your life.
Yeah.
I relate to that for sure.
Oh, the sun shines on the other side of the bluff.
I know, look at that. We're going to be warm here in just a moment. I'm just going to walk down this. Okay, so tell us, what do we got going on here?
Yeah, so Johnson County Parks works really closely with Urban Trail Co., a local nonprofit that builds trails by hand. And you can see here, they have a slope that's a little steeper than you generally want to build trail on, but to get where they wanted to go, they had to do a little bit of cheating here. And so they hand placed every single one of these limestone slabs and then put little pieces of rock in between and then overlaid dirt in that, and they created a sustainable slope that they can get up here, and hikers have traction on and bikes have traction on. But this is all absolutely hand dug, and buckets of rock and hand placed and chiseled in. And so a lot of times we like to see a trail like this. We'd love to see it last 100 years.
Absolutely.
So volunteers have to come back and maintain and add rocks here and there. But when you come into a landscape like this, it took thousands of hours of volunteer labor to build this section of trail. Other sections in the park are machine built and crew built by JCPRD staff, but a lot of these more intricate, narrow, tight areas were built by volunteers that had to hike back in.
That's incredible. And, this is actually the second hand-built stone trail that we have shown here at Deep Roots. The other one, if you folks remember, was from Native Plants at Noon last November at Les Bluffs, where they had the hand-laid limestone staircase. So it's really cool to see that, that tradition still continues with stewardship of our pathways so that we can get closer to nature.
Now we're back.
There we go.
So this drainage is running straight north.
Straight north, okay. So I just found my first columbine. Look at that cutie.
Our first little one there.
Look at that.
Down there.
Oh, they're so cute. So they're...
Yeah, their seeds are amazing. Little tiny little
Oh my god, I know.
pepper seeds.
They are. They're like little shiny black
Cedar trees
gems.
right next to it.
Oh, it's so cute.
We don't want you there.
Hee hee. We want the columbine. Look how beautiful that is. So yeah, a lot of our native, well not a lot, but some of our native species can handle growing in very shallow dirt right on this rock edge. So notice it's getting some nice morning sun, and the moss is probably helping retain a lot of that moisture too, which is supporting this little forb. And I just gotta get a quick photo of this.
The columbine they're phenomenal, but they're becoming really localized. That a lot of our forests have been covered in bush honeysuckle, and a lot of limestone slopes have been developed. And so columbine is really only found in Johnson County and just these protected limestone, cliffs. That we're not finding a lot of locations with it left. You can find it obviously in KCMO along Swope Park and the Bluebird Parkway. Here we have it on our Camp Ranch Future Park site, and we have it here at Cedar Niles. And a few other small locations, but it's just a handful of locations where you can find columbine native hanging on.
Which is so interesting because, you know, columbine is a very common garden cultivar, and of course we have the true native species, which we're seeing here, which is also cultivated for nursery. So just another reason to leave the native plants where they are in their safe spaces and go support our local nurseries who sell them in a very ethical and sustainable way, because don't we want to see more of these out in the landscape? I know I do.
And what's cool about what JCPRD does is we do big parks, and so most of our parks are going to be 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, and so we're not necessarily taking care of city park size areas. That when we're taking care of a natural area, it's at a minimum usually 500 acres, and a couple of them are pushing 2,000. And so what's unique about us is most of our land is broken up into large regional parks with lots of biodiversity within them.
Which is very rare for a lot of you know, municipalities. I mean, because there's just not a lot of natural areas left.
Yeah, and then having somebody that purchased that land and knew what they were looking at, and finding high quality natural areas to purchase back in the day, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, when we acquired these pieces, having folks that were on the ground knowing, you know, what they were looking at and making sure we were grabbing some neat pieces of biodiversity before they were developed.
That's very cool. Oh my gosh. You guys go ahead. I'm staying with the moss. Look at that. And just wait till we get more rain. Yeah, golden groundsel, Packer obovata, or roundleaf groundsel. It's a beautiful little plant. It spreads out nicely, creates a green mulch in your garden, but also provides little cheery yellow flowers that'll be blooming here in the next, I don't know, couple weeks maybe. You can start with one plant and it spreads out into like a nice little colony. And though it does that, it's not necessarily going to be so prolific that it outcompetes other herbaceous forbs. Yeah, look at that.
And so right now we are on the Billy Goat Trail, and on the back side of the sign it says Billy Goat this way. Just to our left we have the Columbine Trail, and so we've come to a decision point where if you've looked at the map at the trailhead and you're looking at something like Trail Forks or another online mapping system, you'll know, or on the JCPRD website, that the Columbine Trail is going to loop back around and the Billy Goat Trail has ended. And so this is just, once you come to a carcinite sign, it's really important to look at both sides of it, orient yourself, and then look for the next sign to make sure you know which direction you're heading.
Gosh, that's a really good tip. Thank you.
Always look at the brown carcinites in the woods.
You're saying I should always read the signs?
Look at the signs.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll start doing that.
You'd be amazed at the amount of people that may get disoriented in an urban area that don't have a lot of experience in the outdoors and are rescued by our park police force. That they get further in, they lose cell reception that they usually have, and many of our parks are cell phone dead zones back in these valleys. And so it's really important to either have a paper map or have a picture of the map saved onto your phone and kind of take bearings, because we've gotten phone calls of people, their battery on their phone's dying, they're not sure where they are, and they need someone to come find them. So even in these urban landscapes, you can get lost.
Yeah, definitely. And how scary would that be? So glad that there are folks out there to help if that is needed.
Do a little pre-work. Just make sure you know where you're going, and then just kind of take note. This sign doesn't have a letter on it, but other signs throughout the system will have a letter that tells you you're at point AA, BB, CC, and you'll know you're crossing another threshold to a next point. And so if you ever need help, all you have to do is call and let folks know, and folks will be dispatched to find you. But just a little pre-trip planning.
Yeah, I'm definitely one to take a photo of a map, grab a paper map if those are available, but always go prepared. I also like to let at least one or two people know where I'm going, especially if I'm hiking alone, and bring water, you know, those kinds of things. So okay, so we are at the crossroads. Goes into the woods there. Let me continue up this way.
The whole top of this ridge is just inundated with eastern red cedar. And so that tells us that some sort of agricultural thing happened. So grazing or pasture land was there, and then at some point, through succession, it became eastern red cedar. So long term, would we open that back up and bring the glade aspect back or the prairie aspect back? We'd like to, but that's one of those projects that is going to take time for us. Once we stabilize a lot of the more pressing natural resource problems, then you would take on more of these pet projects on trying to bring back individual glades.
Yeah, I like where your priorities are at and kind of thinking about the big picture and long term of these areas for future generations to enjoy, right?
Right. So we tend to, if we have a high quality natural area, our goal is to keep that area high quality. And then next, we're chasing down invasive species from the edges and looking for new invasive species, and then further down the tiers is jumping into new restoration projects.
I love to hear it.
And so we have a tiered aspect to how we manage land. So keep the best stuff as good as possible, and then spend our more limited resources further down the line over the course of the summer and the growing season, and see how far we can get.
Cool.
So if we're talking about bringing back this hilltop, you can see that we would begin cutting this cedar and stacking it in really tight brush piles that we would burn on a snowy day. We can see pachyra throughout the landscape, so we would definitely not put the brush pile directly on the native vegetation. Further back, you can see it's devoid of life, where it's just dark shadows. We would probably break that cedar down, and we would start burning these in piles to open this up. And then after a couple years of getting this open, we bring our native seed and plugs back and try to get this ridge back to, possibly pre-settlement conditions. Well, it's hard in a landscape like this. You got neat ephemeral wildflowers, and a lot of north-facing woodland slopes don't necessarily need fire, while more of these upland spots that are covered in the cedars and a lot of the open invasives. Sometimes on these north-facing slopes, we can do more damage versus we could run a really nice fire on the more flat landscapes.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because I was just wondering, like, I know fire depends on enough fuel, right?
Right.
And in the woodlands, yeah, sure, there's duff, but it just doesn't seem like an area that would normally catch. So that's...
Yeah, and that's what these upland areas would burn really well. And so if we did burn a north-facing slope like this to control invasives, you'd want to do it in the just most dormant season. Absolutely no actively growing plants. You'd want to burn a landscape like this in January, late December, sometime when nothing is actively growing. As we came up that drainage, it was steep, but not that steep. Up here, this becomes a very deep north-facing valley.
Wow, it really does. And I couldn't quite see that coming up from the other side. I could see it was steep, but you really get the sense of how steep once you're up here.
Say photos don't do it justice. The further we go, the steeper it becomes, and as we go further to our west, I mean, if you really want a strenuous workout, you can climb up the hillside. I've done it before. I don't recommend it, but you can do it.
Oh, we got back into some ephemeral, so that's really exciting.
Yeah, look at those britches, little Dutchman's.
So we got the Dutchman's breeches all over this little slope.
Check that out. I just love the shape of this plant. It's so fun. Nestled into moss. It's like a little fairy home.
It's still there.
See, I never have good luck spotting wildlife because I'm always distracted by flowers and I'm usually too loud. Wow, look at those. So cute. Yeah, these spring pollinators, specifically Dutchman's breeches. I said it earlier, but it is really important for our early spring pollinators like queen bees that are starting to emerge.
And we've gotten up into now an oak woodland out of that cedar kind of forest, and it's pretty cool to see a forest not inundated with bush honeysuckle in the Kansas City area.
Yeah.
So having a park like this of this scale where you can still get that open feel, that open landscape that has been lost across most of the region. One of the hard things as a natural resource manager is you want people to see cool things, but you also want to make a trail that's sustainable and doesn't remove wildflowers, and that real delicate balance of how do you cut a trail in and take people to amazing things so they learn and care about them, but not vanquish the cool, amazing things. You really have to decide, what you're willing to remove, or what kind of a scar you're willing to put on a landscape to get people to all the neat things. And so that's a really hard balance we have to figure out every day, is where do you bring people so they see the neat stuff, but you don't bring them to a point where they put so many feet on the ground that it actually removes the wildflowers. So
Yeah.
that's something we're learning more about every day and adapting how we build trails.
That's very cool. I appreciate that you're taking the current data and new data rather, and putting that
so
in
we know
consideration.
actually how many people use every one of our trails. So we have trail counters at every entrance, and we have live cloud-based data on how many people are using every trail in our system.
Very cool.
Getting closer to the walking fern. From here down the slope, it becomes a really nice, just solid kind of hillside of ephemeral wildflowers. It was completely inundated with garlic mustard when we opened the park, and volunteers from KC Wildlands have basically rappelled off this slope, hung on to trees, and pulled this garlic mustard out over multiple seasons. We have a couple pockets of bush honeysuckle that need to be dealt with down here, but the garlic mustard was the big kind of threat, and we've really begun to get it under control. But we can see tons of toothwort, Dutchman's breeches. This steep slope is just covered with wildflowers.
Look at all those Dutchman's breeches. This is great. So folks, when you join me for the hike, you'll be able to see more blooms, because hopefully we'll have a little more rain and more sunshine. There's one.
Might have to turn them around a little bit.
Oh, here we go.
There you go, there's a nice view. Yeah, they're pretty wild. They can reproduce and spread vegetatively with the older plants surrounded by their little plantlets that take off, root from their little leaf tips. And they really only grow on ledges, north-facing slopes,
Wow.
moss-covered limestone.
Yeah, you can see the spores right there.
So this, for us, we find these in very limited locations in our parks. This is one of the only spots where we see the walking fern. They become obviously more common where you get more moisture, and we really are the edge of the prairie and the Flint Hills. So seeing ferns on bluffs past here, it gets a lot more limited. There he is.
Oh, wow. Sweet. Oh, there's a deer.
That's another thing on our hike. We'll probably see plenty of wildlife out here. Turkey, deer, different birds. I mean, maybe snakes.
Yes.
There's all kinds of wildlife in this park. Most of my life since the age of 3 in the woods with my dad, either hunting, fishing, exploring. So, while I'm not an expert by any means, I do try to know quite a bit of the species around me and know what I'm encountering when I run into it.
One of the neat aspects about Cedar Niles is that within this landscape, we have neighborhoods that are getting close to us, and so we've worked with the city of Olathe to develop sidewalks to get people to the park safely as a pedestrian. And we're also acquiring land, and we recently purchased some land north of 119th Street, which gets the neighbors and people close to get into us. And as this area develops out with additional land, we're able to connect neighborhoods directly into a large regional park. And so we're always looking at how we can get people into these landscapes. And then you can see this giant power line straight ahead of us. And if you follow it further to the south, you end up at one of the largest remnant prairies in Johnson County. And so Cedar Niles holds about a 40-acre tallgrass prairie that is untouched.
Wow.
And it is going to be hayed this summer. It's been burned in the past. And so not just forest, this park, the 1,000 acres, holds a huge amount of different kinds of biodiversity. And there is a prescribed fire happening on the park landscape later today. So as soon as we're done with this hike today, we're both throwing on our Nomex and jumping on the fire line as soon as we're done filming. And so
That's awesome.
Every day is different.
It is, and that makes it always exciting.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us for that taping of our hike to Cedar Niles. So I would like to go ahead and welcome Matt Garrett and Drew Dobelier to the virtual stage so we can dive into some Q&As about this really cool park that I've only become familiar with thanks to you, Matt, and Johnson County Parks and Rec.
Glad to be here. Very exciting.
Yes. Okay, so before we jump in, we have folks in the audience, if you have questions about Johnson County Parks in general or Cedar Niles Park, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A, but I have a few questions to get us started. So Matt, when we were hiking, you had talked a little bit or a lot about the different topography of Cedar Niles Park. Could you give us a little bit of insight about something that you referred to as ecotone? I thought that was kind of an interesting concept.
Yeah, Johnson County is kind of an interesting place because in Missouri, western Missouri, you've still got a lot of forest. And in Johnson County, it becomes a real intermixed play of prairie and woodlands. And then you move just to Douglas County, and there's a little bit less forest. And we go into complete open, Flint Hills type landscapes once you get past Topeka. And so it makes for a really interesting landscape to have our parks be as much ephemeral wildflowers as glades as prairies. So it's really interesting where some plants are just hanging on because they're really on the edge of the range, and they're rare to us, but they might be pretty common to someone in the Ozarks. So walking ferns maybe in another area might not be special, but they're special to us because we don't have a lot of those big bluffs.
No, we really don't. Um, that's awesome. Drew, we're so happy that you're here joining us also. Like I said earlier, I just had a wonderful time with you two, learning so much about the park here in Olathe. And so I want to talk about a couple things. We actually have some questions from the audience that ties in very well with this episode. One being is someone's asking if going off trail in search of wildflowers, whether or not that is encouraged or discouraged. So I would like for one of you to give us your insight there on trail etiquette and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think it's one of those kind of read the room situations. If it's a really busy park that's pretty small and has a lot of trail use, it's probably worth staying on the trail. If it's one of our bigger parks like Cedar Niles or Bull Creek with thousands of acres to roam with having a little less users depending on the space, it's okay to get off trail for sure. It's legal to get off trail and explore. But just yeah, look at the density of wildflowers around you and whether it's worth stepping off trail. If it's more of an open landscape that you can step around, without doing damage. Some of our trails in Johnson County can see 30,000 users a month. Some of them only see a couple thousand users a month. So it really depends on where you are.
I appreciate that because I know I try to be good and stay on the trail. It's not good or bad necessarily, but just be mindful of my impact in a natural area. So, but sometimes there is a cool plant off to the side that I would love to get a closer look at. And, so I appreciate hearing that there is a balance there. So speaking of having how busy the parks can get, is the public able to check live cloud data to see how busy a park might be if they're thinking about going? Is that something that is set up? I think I've seen that in like Google before, but are you aware of that?
So we check how many people are using trails, but some interesting county park systems in Colorado can actually tell you like how many people are in a given parking lot or how many open spaces there are. We don't have a system set up at this time. We have national park level visitation in Johnson County, but we are not currently showing live data of whether a lot's full or not.
That makes sense. Okay, now Drew, I have a question for you since um, you have talked about your knowledge with trees and you have worked in the landscape for quite a while. Can you talk a little bit about the value of using fire as a tool and how kind of go into a little more detail on how that varies from even like in one place like Cedar Niles, there's like we saw areas that seemed good for burning and others that may not need it. Could you just talk a little bit about that process of using fire as a land management tool?
Sure. So fire as a land management tools really well, especially in this area where we had a lot of tall grass prairie at one time, and we have a lot of woody encroachment moving in now. Fire helps us push back woody encroachment out in our native prairie areas, but also in our woodlands, oak hickory forest It helps keep them clean. They were used to a fire cycle long before, people started settling down and the fire regime kind of disappeared that we once had. So introducing fire again helps reduce the invasive species in our woodlands and helps to encourage more of the native growth that we want in this area.
I think it's yeah, and also just knowing that it's a tool, but it's not the only tool, right? So what are some other land management practices you all may have done at a place like Cedar Niles Park, in addition to, fire in some of those more open areas?
So besides fire, we also use chemical control to get rid of some of our invasive species. We use mechanical control with machines with a forestry mower or brush hogs, brush cutters, chainsaws. Certain species we can hand pull out of the ground. And we have a lot of different, sometimes you use those, like if you're cutting honeysuckle, you can use brush cutters and other things, and then also come back, spray the stump. So you may intertwine several of those things together in order to accomplish what you're wanting to do.
That's
And
really
there is some savanna restoration coming to Cedar Niles that once the forestry mowing that Drew mentioned takes place, we're looking at some of the bottomland forest becoming savanna type landscapes in the future as well.
there's just so many uh different habitat types there at Cedar Niles. It's really cool to see that variety in one place. Linda is asking if you can speak more on the 40 acres of untouched prairie. They're asking if the coefficient of conservation has been calculated to determine the quality of the prairie. Also, how are those high tension wires affecting the natural area, since the utility sprays poison around the base? So,
Yeah, so the power lines in a lot of our parks are actually the reason why some of them still are remnant prairies, which is kind of unusual to think about. But a lot of times they weren't residentially or commercially developed due to the large power poles that may run through Shawnee Mission Park and they run through Cedar Niles and places like that. So we actually get to work directly with Evergy a lot of times, and so they know where our high quality prairies are. So the remnant old growth prairie at Cedar Niles is on 127th Street, just past Cedar Creek as you're heading west on the south side of the road. And Evergy, when they had to replace a pole, they communicate with us and they put down a native seed blend to replace what any damage they did. So we try to work with power companies when they're coming across important landscapes. And I don't have the floristic quality data with Cedar Niles Prairie in front of me. But yeah, we are doing long-term monitoring on the site. It was abused back in the day before we took it over. And so there's areas with phenomenal wildflowers, and then there's areas that have been beat up by previous agricultural or pasture uses of the landscape. And so it's in a hay rotation with fire right now. But down the road with future development of the park, there'll be better access to that prairie.
very cool. So that's kind of leads into the next question, but are there currently any trails around the prairie, or is that potentially a future endeavor?
Yeah, so there's a piece of land that we didn't own in the middle of Cedar Niles. It's called Stone Ridge. It was a private property, and the landowner did sell it to us, and we did a master plan for that site. That's publicly available on the web. And once that node is activated and it becomes a picnic shelter, recreation space, there we're planning on a trail and an observation deck leading out to the Cedar Niles Prairie. So that is a future plan for the site. You can hike there on your own now, but it take a lot of work.
Cool. Someone is asking if you can expand upon the process of hay cycle and burning. What is that process and in relation to a prairie here in the Midwest?
Drew, you want to take a stab at it, or you want me to go?
I was gonna say you know more about the hay leasing
Okay,
stuff with that,
sure.
but
Okay. So the Cedar Niles Prairie, when we took it over and it became a park landscape, it was covered in cedar trees. And we initially put fire on the landscape to get the cedars vanquished. And every prairie is different. Some prairies do really well in a hay cycle where we will hay 2/3 of a prairie in a year, rest a third of it, and then we'll burn half of it the next year. We're always kind of changing up what part of a remnant prairie is getting a management technique. And so the prairie was completely rested last year. We're going to hay probably 2/3 of it this coming season in early August. And then I would say in fall of 25, there'll be a fire on the landscape.
And is part of that the idea of rotating between those management techniques to allow pollinators or wildlife refuge? Like, is that kind of the mindset? Can you speak a little more on that?
Yeah, so we always try to leave up some refugia for our bees. We've done research. Mike Arduzer came and did an exhaustive study of Og Prairie and Kill Creek Prairie, and we found we had new bees to science that haven't even been described possibly in some of our sites. And through that research, we learned since one of our prairies near Cedar Niles was hayed for so many decades, many of the midsummer bees are missing because it was overhayed. And so part of it is doing that resting, haying, burning rotation, always leaving something up to protect invertebrates and knock back our woody invasives. The timing of those fires is really important. Spring fire can really be chaotic, and a late spring fire makes dogwood and sumac really angry, which we found in the Cedar Niles Prairie. It really responds wonderfully to haying, and it really is keeping all the woody invasives to a minimum. Folks like Drew go out in a UTV, and he hunts down individual invasives like Sericea lespedeza a couple times throughout the season.
Mm. So speaking of treating and removing invasive species, Drew, when you've worked in these areas, have you noticed how long sites will accept, or how long it takes for a site to accept new species, whether it's something you all have intentionally planted, seeded, or just to see some native plants return to a site? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the site. We've had some areas that we've seeded, and I mean, a month later, I had plants coming up in that prairie already. And then I've had other fields seeded that have taken 3 years to come around, depending on our rainfall. If we go into a drought, that really affects us. And also what cover was there before. We have some fields that we've had to treat multiple times to get ready for a planting, and then we've had invasives resurge and we've had to fight them off for a couple of years to try to knock them back, and then the native stuff kind of move in. So I mean, weather pending, it is a pretty fast process, but if you don't have the weather on your side, you have a long fight ahead.
Hmm. Yeah, it's we're a very weather dependent sport, aren't we? We find ourselves in.
It's very hard to have put a prairie on the ground and then wait and watch, or any habitat restoration we do. Drew sat on a tractor for hours and put, hundreds of thousands of dollars of prairie seed in the ground. And then we sit back and hope that we get spring moisture, then hope that there's some summer moisture. And so it's really hard as employees for folks like Drew and I to sit back and wait and watch and hope that these things grow.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I want to thank you both for joining me today and our viewers for just a wonderful insight into Cedar Niles Park. And before we leave, I want to invite you all to join us at Cedar Niles on Saturday, April 13th. We will be doing I will be leading a guided hike with Drew. So Drew knows a lot about trees and wildlife and all kinds of things out there. And as you heard, he has traversed that site many times. So I hope you'll consider joining us. And until then, tune in for our next webinar. We have our native plants at noon. Let me pull it up real quick. Our next episode will be Thursday, April 18th at noon. Native Plants at Noon. We're exploring another natural area with MDC. So tune in and enjoy this wonderful spring weather. And I hope you will consider visiting Cedar Niles Park on your next adventure. Thank you.